If I had to name a single core strength of the Binding of Isaac franchise, the uncontested winner would be novelty. This quality shouldn't be taken lightly, especially in a game and broader culture market that rewards being derivative and frequently undervalues venturing outside cookie-cutter formulas.
In this regard, we should start our analysis by noting that The Binding of Isaac finds itself in a particularly important position in roguelike history. For roughly 30 years, the genre of roguelikes had calcified around rather narrow extensions of the principles laid out by the original Rogue from 1980. And don't get me wrong, you can find some really fascinating design ideas and ludo aesthetics in traditional roguelikes, but hindsight lets us realize that these ideas didn't need to be confined to the rigid structures laid out by many of the genre's forerunners. The genre was brilliant, but it was also stagnant, especially compared to the revolution it was going to experience in the 2010s. It was an incredible display of irony when two very opposite events became central to the genre's history within just a few months of each other. In September 2008, we saw the Berlin interpretation of roguelikes, an embodiment of the radically ossified perception of roguelikes within the community. Being hilariously specific and bloated, it comes off as a group of technically minded programmers' misled attempt at broaching the walls of game design. I can't overstate how poor this is as an attempt to understand the genre. Disaster struck for the Berlin interpretation just 3 months later when the genre took an important turn. Although games like Diablo or ToeJam and Earl had already toyed with the roguelike format, the newly released Spelunky found unparalleled success in capturing the most important game design novelties of the genre while completely abandoning elements that were superficial to these ideas. Spelunky is a super trashy game, and it's also one of the best games ever. It's just weird, man. Spelunky is a favorite of many game designers, and I love this game, but I can also see why it didn't exactly become the new blueprint for roguelikes. From its ungratifying in-run progression all the way to its brutally narrow failure spectrum, it ends up being a very hostile experience to those who lack the patience to engage with it deeply. There was proof here of untapped roguelike potential, but the future still appeared blurry through the lens of getting spedunked on. 3 years later, designer Edmund Macmillan, inspired by Spelunky and The Legend of Zelda, released The Binding of Isaac. The game revolutionized the roguelike genre to the point where there's still ongoing debates about whether these newcomers count as roguelikes at all. To avoid splitting hairs, and because it's morally the right thing to do, I will be using roguelike to denote both traditional roguelikes and so-called roguelites, and if you disagree with this, then you're wrong, and shame on you. 3 more years passed before the release of the remake, The Binding of Isaac Rebirth, which exploded in the mass market and is still considered the canonical modern roguelike. By now, this franchise's novelty should be apparent. It unshackled the potential of the genre from very calcified designs, and basically all the big hits of the roguelike genre we've seen since can be traced back, in some form or another, to Macmillan's 2011 Flash game.
I don't really like the Binding of Isaac games. I've played them a lot. At the time of recording, I have almost 600 hours combined across them, but a vast majority of my time with them has been disappointing. And yet I strongly respect them. These games pioneered a new approach, and it's common among such trendsetter media that some of the new ideas don't quite pan out. Slip-ups are expected when there is nothing else to learn from. It is from this perspective that I will conduct my game design critique, not because we need to find something to hate, but because the genre keeps evolving. And now that we have another almost 15 years of games refining the formula, studying the forerunners' mistakes seems vital for growth. You will hear strong criticisms, but this is perhaps the mildest possible form of critique, built on a recognition of the game's importance and carried out for the sake of learning. As it stumbled in a completely new direction, even Isaac's problems were novel, which makes for a wildly fascinating case study that I felt hasn't been adequately explored. Mostly we're here to have fun discussing roguelike design, but if you want to put it in more serious terms, a genre reaches adolescence only when it stops copying its origins and begins to recognize their shortcomings. So really, we're here to save the roguelike genre, and some would say, the whole world.
A few notes before we proceed. First and foremost, if you happen to be the type of person to place value primarily on the amount of content in a game, here's a very short review just for you. The Buyzack, Fuyzack, Rezack has a lot of hours in it, and it costs little monies. The end. As for the rest of us, in this video we try to consider these games as works of art and not simply as products. By this I don't mean to revive debates about the artistic value of games. I'm simply clarifying that I want to discuss commonly overemphasized metrics like the amount of content compared to the price. To the degree it's possible and productive to do so, I will analyze these games as isolated works of media. I am one of those horribly pretentious people who think that "is this game worth my money?" is the least interesting question in game design.
Let's not think about how capitalism is affecting our media analysis. Instead, I want to turn our attention to another challenge for us. Video games are a perfect example of how the postmodern age denies us of drawing clear boundaries around a work of media. There are 2 Binding of Isaac games, Rebirth being an expanded remake of the original, and Rebirth also has 4 DLCs and a blasphemous number of mods. That is to say, it can be difficult to pinpoint what we're actually talking about when we talk about the Binding of Isaac.
For our purposes, we're mostly talking about Rebirth with DLCs but without mods. But we're also talking about both games in all permutations. When I feel like some special distinction is relevant, I will try to make it clear which version of the game I'm referring to. Otherwise, you'll have to bear with my vague designations like the franchise or simply Isaac. The important thing is that we will be ignoring any mods that didn't get canonized into DLCs. Attempting any analysis of such collective authorship as we find in modded games is an incredibly interesting and difficult topic, but it's simply not the purpose of this particular video. You might sense I'm saying this a bit defensively, and that's because I don't want to see my criticisms dismissed on account of the game being heavily moddable. Of course, we could talk about how the original designs often inform modders of what is considered acceptable and valuable, or how the base game provides a specific design space for mods, but more fundamentally, we're interested in analyzing some very concrete designs. To move the conversation towards consumers being able to find mods would be, again, to shift the focus from the game design to the game as a product. I hope these distinctions are clear. I feel they're necessary to narrow our conversation to topics of game design, instead of debating the appropriate price for a game with a Steam workshop so indescribable that you can just boot up the game and drive a Toyota if such is your heart's desire. Whatever.
I'm well aware that I'm putting myself in a difficult position by criticizing one of the most beloved indie games of all time, and you might have already decided to hate me and everything I stand for. I want to make it abundantly clear that my goal isn't just to find excuses to dislike Isaac. In fact, I think it's only fair if we start this essay by exploring the positives in this franchise, because admittedly, Isaac's best qualities are exceptional, and keeping them in mind will be necessary to fully understand the flaws.
Starting outside the realm of pure game design, let's take for example the narrative. The Binding of Isaac is a modern spin on the biblical story of the same name, where Abraham receives orders from God to sacrifice his son Isaac in a test of faith, and as Abraham complies, he is interrupted by an angel at the last moment. The games set this myth in a modern, zealously religious household and follow it from Isaac's perspective. After he overhears God ordering his pious Catholic mother to sacrifice him, he escapes through basements full of grotesque monstrosities, which he wards off with his projectile tears, and eventually has to confront his mother. The plot doesn't go much further than this, but the story underneath it is rich with fascinating detail. Now, the game is hermeneutically ambiguous, which is to say it explicitly hints at multiple, mutually exclusive readings of the same events. And yet we can loosely identify a most coherent interpretation. The game's events are a fantasy dreamt up by Isaac, who, unsettled and overwhelmed by Christian myths and teachings, as well as the restrictive upbringing of his devout mother, projects himself in the story of the Binding of Isaac. The setting of the game consists of his fears and obsessions, childish imagination tainted with religious trauma and isolation. Unable to bear the weight of his own guilt, Isaac suffers a panic attack and traps himself in his toy chest. His delirious fantasy spirals out of control as he suffocates and dies.
The story thus transparently revolves, first and foremost, around the traumatizing and oppressive effect that dogmatic religion can have on children, and the smaller threads and ideas through which the game explores this topic are admirably multifaceted. It's a story about Catholic guilt, Christian theology's overall obsession with impurity and sin, religion's strain on a family, and the innately dark and disturbing elements of the Christian mythos that most adults will interpret allegorically, but a child might regard as horrifying ontological truths. It is, in some ways, a love letter to this mythology, but predominantly it is a critique of institutional religion.
Although at times it feels like the game might get distracted, it's appropriate that we always return to this biblical tale, and Isaac's mother remains positioned as the primary antagonist. The ultimate tragedy is that to Isaac, all of these monsters and devils and embodiments of sin aren't as frightening as the thought that his own mother might abandon and kill him at the request of some invisible and unknowable mastermind, a nightmare implanted in him directly from the Bible.
Isaac's story is unquestionably powerful in its themes, though if you'll forgive me, I have to nitpick the storytelling of these games just for a little bit, because the execution of how they explore these topics is sometimes clumsy.
One of the first things many people notice about these games is their obsession with the obscene generally and poop specifically. The non-stop barrage of imagery surrounding the human body and its excretions, as well as death, violence, and illness, can be off-putting to some, but all of this is, I would argue, thematically fitting. The story follows the fantasies of a child, and children are obsessed with everything that's crass or taboo. The infantile point of view only adds to Isaac's character. Macmillan seems to pride himself on a rather lowbrow approach to storytelling, and although his style has met a fair deal of criticism, it seems like The Binding of Isaac is conceptually the best possible story for him to tell. It makes sense that this Isaac is based on the designer. The more you learn about Macmillan, the more you realize that he very bluntly enjoys vulgarity, but his crass style is perfectly at home here.
I like the idea of not sticking my nose in the air and I'm discussing religion here. I just don't think that because there's really dark humor in anything, that it's a throwaway to the substance. That's the way I do things. I put shit all over it. I rub some poop all over it just to make sure people know, life's not a fucking serious experience.
Yeah. But a lot of people write it off as garbage because there's a lot of dark humor in it.
Right.
And they write it off as like, oh, it's not serious. And I just get so sick of things that are just serious. I'm not just serious.
On the other hand, you might have already noticed a problem. There is a disconnect, a tension between the particular sort of childish naivete that would enhance Isaac's perspective versus Macmillan's indiscriminate coarseness. For example, the narrative is cheapened by excessive pop culture references and inside jokes. It becomes very hard not to feel distracted by Macmillan's constant presence throughout this game. Like, Isaac is supposedly dreaming up blatant references to popular video games, Rick and Morty, or Neil Breen. At some point you start to feel like it's not Isaac's childish fascinations driving the story, but the developer's own perspective.
I would say fucking 50% of the items are named after songs that I like, you know what I mean? It's like, there's so many references to just things that I enjoy.
The problem is not that the game isn't serious. Games don't need to be serious. The problem is that Macmillan couldn't hold his focus on telling a cogent story. He wants to construct a narrative, but he also wants to paint a self-portrait, and the latter is just not nearly as interesting as Isaac's story. Regardless of how you feel about Macmillan's style, and there's a lot of feelings that could be had, what's undeniable is that his voice sometimes drowns out the voice of Isaac, and every so often fails to treat the themes with the care and respect they deserve. This detracts from what could have been some very interesting narrative design.
I should also note that the Repentance DLC is a significant downgrade in quality compared to the rest of the story. The Ascent is notable as being particularly heavy-handed and awkward. The exaggerated dialogue is really out of place in what is otherwise a very subtle game, and the mishmash of ideas at the end borders on directionless, with the exception of the excellent dogma fight. Nonetheless, I don't want to press too heavily on these flaws. I may not like some storytelling decisions, but I feel like overall the game's narrative deserves praise. It's carried by extremely powerful themes, which are explored, for the most part, with suitable restraint. Another reasonably strong point is the visuals. The games both look hideous, they have the overall color and facture of vomit, but without the visual coherence. The games oscillate rapidly between somewhat serious depictions of religious iconography and cartoonish, caricaturistic body horror. Their color palette is all over the place, and combined with several thick and creamy layers of shaders, Rebirth is the kind of game that pixel art purists might consider an insult to their craft. All of this sounds bad, but I promise I actually like it. It's ugly as hell, and that's perfect for the story and setting. Consider that these games follow the delirious fantasies of a traumatized child. When you look at the visual design through this lens, you realize it couldn't have been more apt. Likewise, the soundtrack is very fitting. It switches between cautiously mysterious and bombastic, and in both of these modes it combines the atmosphere of a dingy cellar with a distinctly Christian undertone. In both games I found myself especially appreciating the regular background tracks over boss music. I believe they embody a sense of held back and muted panic, which really carries the vibe. Music is also one of the few areas where I prefer the original game. Rebirth's soundtrack is great, but for the original they had Danny Baranowsky, who as usual is super expressive and catchy. Still, I think my favorite part is all the little jingles throughout the games, like how whenever you find a secret room you get this little piano motif. It really feels as if the sound design bridges gameplay and music in a cohesive whole that few other games can compare with.
And now, for the rest of the video, we must turn our attention to matters of game design. Obviously, this will be the area I will criticize the most, but there are qualities of the system design that deserve praise. Isaac's design has one fascinating strength that is both essential to roguelikes and to this day not handled as brilliantly in any other action roguelike, at least to my knowledge. I'm talking about modularity.
Both within game design and general system theory, modularity describes the degree to which a system's components may be separated and recombined. Thus, in a game design context, modular systems are such that consist of interchangeable and interconnected objects, properties, and rules. This is incredibly important and very easy to overlook in roguelike design. Perhaps the most valuable part of the roguelike aesthetic is a certain systemic curiosity, where a player explores the emergent limits of these randomly realized game mechanics, and this is achieved through highly modular systems. This intrinsic playful curiosity is combined with extrinsic pleasure, as these unexpected outcomes are often tied to progression, ergo power fantasies. Some refer to these powerful runs as breaking the game, even though it's actually one of the most natural parts of roguelike design. Similarly, synergies between items are frequently cited as one of the core tenets of modern roguelike design. Such synergism is actually an effect of modular systems. So by looking at modularity, we've gone one layer deeper in roguelike design. You'll be forgiven for thinking this sounds too abstract and academic. It can be difficult to spot the link between theoretical game design and actual tangible aesthetics. So to really drive home the importance of modularity in roguelike design, let's look at some case studies. Slay the Spire has some of the best roguelike system design ever made, and it's a trendsetter in the turn-based roguelike category. It seems like a simple deck builder where you use energy to play cards that either do damage or add protection, which negates incoming damage. It also features roguelike elements that work brilliantly due to the game's modularity. The process of simply playing a card consists of a large amount of smaller parts. When your turn starts, you randomly draw cards of 4 distinct kinds to your hand. Then you can play any of them against a target. This costs energy, but it creates some result, be it damage, protection, status effects, or other. And after this, the card is either discarded or exhausted, meaning you won't get to use it again this combat. These parts are first off shared by almost every card in the game, and secondly extremely malleable by other mechanics. For each of these steps, you'll find a whole bunch of cards, effects, and trinkets that affect how this particular step behaves. Just a few well-combined changes are enough to create new, potentially very powerful connections in this web of mechanics. So here was a run where I had various ways to spawn a lot of Shiv cards. Shivs cost 0 energy and do a small amount of damage. They're simple attack spam. I also had a card named Envenom, which makes any of my attacks inflict a single point of poison, which is damage over time. These make a decent synergy because the sheer amount of Shivs ensures many opportunities to inflict poison. But additionally, I had a Snecko Skull trinket, which adds 1 point of poison whenever I apply poison. If I used, say, a card that applies 5 poison, the +1 wouldn't mean much, but with my Shiv and Envenom combo, the poison output was doubled. This very satisfying combo was facilitated by the deep modularity of the game's systems. And this is, mind you, a very limited glimpse in Slay the Spire's modularity, and only from the perspective of playing a card, when in fact the game has a whole bunch of systems made up of interconnected and malleable mechanics. The effect is exactly what we described: non-stop curiosity about the game and a frequent dopamine rush from the power of your build. It's wildly emergent and full of very fulfilling discoveries. As a counterexample, we can look at another beloved roguelike, Hades. Don't misunderstand, Hades is a brilliant game in many ways, but I would argue its game design is its least excellent aspect, and while it features a compelling progression system, it fails to capture the roguelike appeal, largely due to its lack of modularity. The absence of modularity can be traced to its weapon system. The game features 6 lovingly crafted and distinct basic movesets, and on their own they might be very well designed, but crucially, there is very little overlap between how these weapons work. There is no room in the design space to achieve modularity. Compare this to Enter the Gungeon, where the hundreds of weapons mostly follow a singular structure. They are guns that shoot bullets. No weapon in Gungeon is half as interesting as any weapon in Hades, but their similarity allows the progression system to create sweeping and universal changes with emergent effects. You can find an item that gives your bullets a homing effect towards the cursor, and this changes the behavior of almost any gun in the game. It may be a trivially simple example of synergism, but it feels amazing to then recognize that all shotguns have become very powerful due to their spread being nullified. Gungeon's pitfall is that it doesn't exploit this modularity nearly enough. The boons in Hades don't provide qualitative changes to the combat system, because how could they? The weapons are too distinct, too lacking in modularity, so the game's in-run progression sticks largely with very safe numerical changes and status effects, neither being particularly compelling. The qualitative variety comes solely from a smaller set of upgrades which are separate for each weapon, which fails to create the same magic of discovering new system behaviors. Hades makes up for this with insanely polished moment-to-moment gameplay and well-crafted systems of extrinsic rewards, but while it's an excellent game, it's not a good roguelike. In fact, this lack of modularity seems to be a key failure point for many games that don't manage to capture the roguelike appeal.
The Binding of Isaac is to date the unbeaten champion of modern roguelike system modularity. It presents the player with an amazing array of deeply intertwined systems, which in turn creates incredible potential for highly emergent synergies.
Say, let's visualize the system interactions of bombs. It's a straightforward mechanic. You have a finite amount of bombs which can be dropped on the ground, where after a little while they explode. They do a lot of damage to enemies, and they can also destroy rocks. Importantly, explosions can be used to push rocks into adjacent chasms, which bridges them. Next, each room has 4 potential locations for a door. These doors are closed during combat, but can be opened by force using a bomb. When the walls don't have doors, they may be hiding entrances to secret rooms, which are opened with a bomb's explosion. Bombs also destroy various machines, beggars, shopkeepers, and other interactables, and their knockback pushes around pickups and chests. Just when a bomb is placed, it can be pushed around by Isaac, his tiers, or different enemies, which can be used to give it some range. Combined with their ability to push around pickups, this also lets you retrieve pickups from dangerous locations, such as behind spikes. So, as you can see, bombs are versatile and interconnected with other systems, and they're just one element in a system web so vast that I wouldn't dare to try visualizing it. The magical part is that these interactions can be manipulated and recontextualized as the player finds new items. The items affecting bombs not only synergize among themselves, but also ripple out through this web. Not all interactions are interesting, but there's so many of them across so many systems that hundreds of hours in, you'll still remain deeply curious about how they interact and synergize. Of course, the extreme form of this modularity is found in the projectiles you shoot, and the loveliest part of the game is exploring and utilizing the combinatorial explosion of projectile item synergies. It's only appropriate that the game's DLC spend considerable effort increasing the amount of working and functional interactions between different projectile types. Isaac's projectile system is not just clever from a game design standpoint, it's also an impressive technical feat. The particularities of Isaac's production have done the game a huge favor in this regard. This deep modularity is the most unique success of the franchise's systems design, but undeniably the design has other decisions that just make sense. From the branching paths in the level progression or the extrinsic satisfaction of completion marks, all the way to the increase of difficulty via meta progression, the games are overall competently designed. We won't cover all these decisions in detail because none of them are as exceptional as the modularity, but we'll keep in mind that a majority of decisions underlying the game design are satisfactory.
It's really just 3 big flaws we'll cover for the remaining video. 3 problems that hold back what is otherwise a fantastic concept. I don't think the Binding of Isaac has poor design. I think it has strong, if a little aged, design that had the potential to be exceptional. And any other roguelike designers trying to unlock the genre's potential need to study the 3 ways in which Isaac fell short. We'll start with the quickest, simplest, and arguably the least damning of our 3 main criticisms. Namely, we'll cover the Kinaesthetics, the game feel of Isaac. This encompasses controls, camera, feedback, and other design aspects relating to how interactions feel on a subconscious sensory level. The Binding of Isaac's game feel, especially that of its combat, is clunky and frustrating to interact with, which in turn takes away from the better qualities of the game. I want to be surgically careful here because I've heard the narrative online that game designers have a certain tunnel vision. They only accept what is narrowly considered objectively correct game design, but fail to appreciate unorthodox games. For what it's worth, I have seen game criticisms that fall into this category, though in my personal experience this is untrue for any game designer or critic worth their salt. Nonetheless, I feel it's necessary to address this. I'm not just criticizing Isaac's game feel because it goes counter to the big book of game design or whatever.
I don't mind games with an orthodox game feel. In fact, I have a special admiration for games that venture outside the beaten path. Rain World, Snake Pass, and Katamari Damacy are games with control systems at least as clunky and unwieldy as that of the Binding of Isaac, and yet I wouldn't go out of my way to criticize the movement in any of these games. What makes these examples different from Isaac is that the unwieldy controls are used with some justification. They add to the experience. In Snake Pass, the controls are the core mechanic. Mastering the movement is the challenge of the game and its whole point. Meanwhile, games like Rain World or Outer Wilds are also fun to master, but more importantly, they use their control schemes to enhance a fantasy. If your spaceship was as smooth to drive as a car in GTA 5, an important component of the scrappy astronaut vibe would be missing. I can even appreciate the extreme end of weird movement schemes, where the undisputed champion is Bennett Foddy, designer of Co-op and Getting Over It. It would be a simplification to claim these games are, like Snake Pass, built around mastering a control scheme. These games lie too far outside the status quo game structures for such a conventional framework like Mastery to explain them. Any internal reading of these games will be incomplete. They begin to make sense only when considering them as meta. As a starting point, they should be read simultaneously as a joke, as a commentary, and as deconstruction. It isn't immediately obvious why Isaac doesn't fit with the examples we've shown here. I mean, you could try and argue that the limiting and restricting game feel makes you empathetic towards the helpless infant that you're supposed to play as, and that's a good thing, right? Well, not quite. There are some serious problems in itemless Isaac, the twin-stick shooter at the base of the roguelike, and these problems distract from the game's best parts. Isaac's controls are unorthodox due to the shooting. You can fire projectiles only in the 4 cardinal directions. So if you use a keyboard, WASD is for movement and arrow keys are for firing, with no default option to fire diagonally. The traditional approach, of course, would be aiming with your mouse or allowing free twin-stick firing for the controller. As far as the movement system goes, this one is not particularly interesting. On its own, it adds very little to the gameplay. By the time the player figures out how to angle their shots, they've pretty much mastered the controls, and this happens relatively quickly in a game that's supposed to last for hundreds of hours. Any potential benefit from this control scheme seems to be easily outweighed by the sheer elegance and pleasure of free aiming. In this sense, Isaac is aged. It has inherited some of the poorest design trends from its Flash legacy. We'll compare this to, in some ways, the closest sibling of Isaac, at least in terms of structure. I am, of course, referring to it. Enter the Gungeon is a roguelike twin-stick shooter that nails game feel. Free aiming helps a lot, but if we put these games side by side, we'll notice many other ways in which the basic interactions of Gungeon are far superior. The first thing you should note is the camera. Gungeon is an honorary bullet hell. You have a zoomed-out view with small and intuitive hitboxes. It is effectively top-down, though the camera is not positioned directly above, it stylistically displays some vertical information. Still, because the camera is zoomed out, all this Z-axis information is squished. You don't have to worry about verticality, and all hitboxes are easy to read. Isaac's camera is much more cramped, and it constantly struggles with the horrible decision to incorporate the Z-axis into the gameplay. Isaac's god-awful hitboxes are a natural consequence of trying to squeeze 3 dimensions of information in a 2-dimensional environment.
And even the tier height, like I still don't understand why the hell that is in there.
Yeah.
But it's part of the charm.
I don't think charm is the right word. It's quirky, and that's not always a good thing. In this case, the basic twin-stick shooter and bullet hell elements of gameplay never feel right. The physical interactions don't happen where they are displayed. Another valuable point of comparison is counterplay. A single-player combat system can be divided in 2 parts, player-to-enemy interactions and enemy-to-player interactions. It's easy to get hung up on player-to-enemy interactions, like making every weapon fun to use. However, the best combat systems are those that also consider enemy-to-player interactions. This is what is meant by counterplay, the gameplay of countering incoming attacks. So good counterplay means the player is given engaging tools for reacting to danger. Gungeon pulls this off excellently. Enemy bullets are clear, visible and consistent. There is room for the player to maneuver around them, and most importantly, the basic moveset contains the dodge roll. It's not a particularly original mechanic, but it adds so much. The player has a very elegant and satisfying tool to use as a reaction to enemy attacks, and it takes a very long time to fully master. Isaac's counterplay is nowhere near as thought out. Your only recourse is avoiding incoming projectiles, but the game isn't built to facilitate this. The interesting hitboxes aside, the visual goulash all over your screen interferes with your ability to spot danger, and the level design sometimes squeezes you in annoyingly restrictive spaces. This is not just a game feel problem, it also extends to the content of Isaac. The most distinct comparison is the boss fights. The bosses in Gungeon are lovingly crafted around counterplay. If you pay attention to their phases, you can almost taste hints of the dev's thought process in making each attack fun to evade, like the excellently crafted but very simple Kill Pillars battle. Isaac has some very effective bosses, but for others, the underlying thought process seems to have been centered around cool things that a boss can do, rather than the enjoyment of countering those attacks. This is taken to the extreme in Isaac's worst boss fight, Delirium. The fight revolves around a gimmick. Delirium regularly and rapidly transforms into modified versions of the bosses you have previously encountered in that run. It's thematically interesting, as Isaac's fantasy devolves into a delirious jumble of fears. However, the fight itself, even after being updated in response to initial backlash, has terrible counterplay. The idea only works on paper. The rapid teleportation, state switching, and overabundance of attacks makes for an illegible experience. The boss feels awful to evade. It's a battle built around shallow spectacle with little thought given to counterplay. And even though it is the worst example in the game, with some other fights being very competently designed, it is still emblematic of broader issues in the game's design that Gungeon avoids. Now, Gungeon is no game design masterpiece. It has weird pacing issues where the game takes several hours to really get going, and as we mentioned, Isaac is undefeated at modularity, while Gungeon's systems are comparatively less interesting and its synergy system far less exciting or elegant. Still, I hope the comparison has convinced you that Isaac's twin-stick shooter gameplay is, at the very least, poorly aged.
Even if we are lenient towards clunky movement systems, this particular one is not a good fit. It detracts from the game's best qualities.
You know how the second half of your run is the part where everything interesting happens, while the first half is a dreary slog? A lot of roguelikes, including my own, struggle with this, as you need a certain amount of progression to make a unique build. In Isaac, this problem is exacerbated by the game feel. The game forces you to spend half your time suffering with a terrible core moveset, waiting for the cool build to finally arrive. This is part of what I meant when I said I don't really have a good time playing this game. I love the game's core appeal of discovering builds, but a significant part of my playtime is clogged up by a slow and unpleasant twin-stick shooter. Nobody's favorite part of Isaac is the very beginning of a run. I have to clarify here that unpleasant is not the same thing as difficult. It's not a matter of difficulty when the beginning of the game, the easiest part of it, gets boring really fast. This could have been remedied if the game's basic interactions were enjoyable. Drawing again the comparison with Gungeon, even if there were no items or progression in Gungeon, you could still have a short bit of fun with its combat system, and even hundreds of hours in, the first level is still passable, in large part due to the dodge roll. Itemless Isaac has the advantage of room variety, but its basic interactions don't hold up. Since the game feel is so unsatisfying, this places all the burden of making Isaac fun on the progression. You need items to fix your moveset. One could hope that this design at the very least makes items feel more rewarding. The 2D Risk of Rain games are also pretty kinesthetically flimsy and restrictive near the beginning, but they address this problem through rapid-fire progression. It's not graceful, but the end experience works. Isaac offers two ways to transcend the messy game feel. Ideally, your build becomes actually pleasurable to interact with, like how Tech X just feels better than basic projectiles, partially because it makes those 4 cardinal directions less dominant. Your other option is to get so powerful that you don't need to engage with the game's shoddy kinesthetics. Like, if you can kill all enemies in a room instantly, you get to bypass the game's terrible systems for avoiding projectiles.
Either way, Isaac relies entirely on progression. But unfortunately, Isaac's progression trips over the ball dropped by its basic combat mechanics. We'll spend the rest of the video covering this, as the flaws in Isaac's progression are far more serious than its lacking game feel. One distinction you'll encounter frequently in game design is that between systems design and content design. And the distinction should be somewhat intuitive from name alone. Systems design refers to the broad strokes in game design, the zoomed out fundamental workings of a game that underlie groups of mechanics, while content design relates to smaller particularities such as individual items or enemies. You can see how it makes more sense for a critic to focus on systems design instead of content design, right? Because systems are more fundamental to the experience of the game, while excessively covering content design would seem nitpicky.
And so when we criticized the game feel, it made sense to talk about controls and hitboxes and camera, rather than focus on content design details such as the scientific fact that Jacob and Essa are just completely asked to control and should never have been added to the game.
Also, speaking from experience, content is much easier to design than original systems. It's simply not that common to find non-derivative games where problems in content design keep up with the problems of systems design. And that brings us to Isaac. The overall philosophy of content design in Isaac is absolutely maddening, and especially in Rebirth. I'll put it simply, there is way too much stuff in Rebirth.
This is a difficult position to defend, especially on the internet, where it's often taken as a truism that more content equals better. So I'm asking you to keep an open mind while I slowly build my case here. I am far from the first person to raise this topic, which I've heard some Isaac fans rather narrowly refer to as item bloat. However, the term we're going to use here to describe an overabundance of content is accretion. As far as I can tell, in a game design context it was coined by Extra Credits, who used it to describe an endless layering of new content in MMOs that makes older content obsolete. So think something like World of Warcraft, where the game has become bloated, incoherent, and hostile to new players. And it's not hard to figure out why this happens in MMOs. These are games someone could play for a very long time while potentially remaining a paying customer. So there's an obvious, albeit myopic, incentive to keep the veteran players engaged with a barrage of new content. It's simply the live service model eating its own tail. This isn't nearly as logical in premium single-player games where the monetary incentive to keep adding content is much weaker. Some games like Terraria can pull it off decently, while in others we see the same unfortunate side effects of accretion that MMOs can suffer from. I know this is far from a universal experience, but I remember dreading every update of Dead Cells, as the slow and steady content bloat made the game less and less inviting.
The reason why I like the term accretion so much is that it gives us a framework through which we can describe the a priori effects of excessive content design, regardless of what that content actually is. So we will eventually get to the specifics of Isaac's content design, but we can start from a more abstract position and discuss the overall effects of having too much stuff.
First, there is an initial analysis paralysis where new players become overwhelmed with all the information they now have to learn. This is a pitfall for many MMOs, where new players can struggle getting past that initial realization of the game's massive size. As for Isaac, I made the savvy decision of familiarizing myself with each DLC before buying the next one, and I played the original before trying Rebirth. For me, the vibe near the beginning was mysterious but manageable. I imagine someone who hops right into Repentance might have a worse time, but I can't comment here.
Second, even if the player gets over that initial scare, accretion still inflates the game with information that the player must keep track of. Let's bring some game design theory into this. A game's complexity describes the mental strain of information the player has to process or remember. A game's depth describes the amount of interesting consequences you get from this information.
Factorio is a complex and deep game. Cookie Clicker is neither complex nor deep. So depth is generally good to have. It defines how ludologically interesting the game is. Complexity, on the other hand, is something we generally want to minimize through simple mechanics, well-designed tutorials, and intuitive UI, as it is tied to rote memorization. It's the distinction between dynamics literacy, that is, understanding the exciting behaviors of a game system, versus mechanics literacy, or simply remembering the individual parts of that system.
This difference is best understood through board games. Nobody's favorite part is reading the rules. The idea of elegance is best explored by Anthropy, but we'll keep it simple. A game is elegant if it has high depth but low complexity.
Chess is an elegant game. Not all games need to be elegant, but on the level of mechanics and content, elegance is a very useful framework for spotting problems. It's hard to overstate the importance of this. Perhaps the most common mistake in game design is adding stuff for the sake of adding stuff, without it contributing to the gameplay in any meaningful capacity. I go so far as to tell my students that every time they add a new idea to the game, they're actively making the game worse, and this new addition needs to be important enough to justify the noise it's creating. A game suffering from accretion will have an elegance problem. There is a lot of information, a lot of noise the player must keep track of. Since the player has finite cognitive resources, this is in constant tension with our loftier goals of concentrating on interesting system behaviors. You can already guess how this relates to The Binding of Isaac. Isaac is a game with generally elegant systems design, but extremely inelegant content design. It struggles with information clutter. The game has an unfathomable amount of mechanics and content to keep track of, yet in service of a mysterious vibe, the game withholds a lot of needed guidance from the player, only compounding the issue. Now, the common response is that this is all intentional. Macmillan wants to spark a certain curiosity in the player as they try to figure out the game's mysteries.
There's a reason why I don't explain, a lot, and it's to create the magic, and it's to the undefined magic of the game and make the game feel more alive and more endless. I do hope that most people go in spoiler free, and I know that a lot of people will read the wiki and go through it and check out all the items and spoil themselves, but when designing the game, I hope that the majority don't, because there's a magic that I'm trying to create with the design. Requires no spoilers. I know that there's wikis all over the place that explain every little detail, but I'd like to think that most people don't go in looking at the wiki first, and they can kind of experiencing it, how it was intended.
I can appreciate this intention, and I love games that respect the player's intellect and let them piece together the mechanics. However, there are really clear differences between how mystery is handled in a game like Isaac versus, say, Outer Wilds, where it's not just implied that mysteries are the point of the game and bypassing them would spoil the experience, but also, crucially, the mysteries are made to be solved. The player is given an appropriate number and nature of clues to make deduction engaging, and both the questions and the answers are deeply captivating. In Isaac, what exactly is the point of participating in the mystery? It's not a riveting puzzle to organically deduce what, say, Cliff of Balance does, as the process of piecing it together and the actual answer are deeply uninteresting compared to everything else in the game. There's a few places in the system design where you do feel that sense of mystery, like figuring out how Devil and Angel rooms work, but especially in the content design, most of the unknown is just bland. Macmillan is right to identify a certain cheapness in using a wiki, not just due to spoilers, but also because alt-tabbing to a wiki is boring and interrupts the game's flow. But he has also created a game that highly encourages using a wiki. It is the most effective approach, and the sense that it's cheating or that it ruins the experience isn't really present because the player recognizes that this mystery is pointless. Using a wiki is lame, but it is so much better than playing Isaac without a wiki, an experience that borders on hostile design. The game stubbornly provides only a few, often worthless words about each item, with obviously no codex of any sorts to help you track this information. Without a wiki, you're left desperately trying to understand and remember every detail in a game where most details are really dull. To this day, whenever I encounter the scapular, I sigh and open the wiki, because even after looking it up 100 times, I still can't remember what it does, because it's a stupid item. It's even worse with the almost 200 trinkets, as most of their effects are too vapid to be worth remembering. Some content, like a few of the pill effects, seems to exist specifically for the point of confusing the player. Macmillan has expressed that all too common developer sentimentality of remembering the good old days when we shared mysteries in the schoolyard or early internet forums. But with the evolution of the internet, this vision of collective investigation has died, or at least evolved to an unrecognizable form, that is, the ARG, which does little for the average player. The best mysteries now are the individually solved ones of Outer Wilds or Tunic or even La Mulana, where refusing to simply read the wiki is established as an implicit code of good sportsmanship. Isaac hasn't kept up with the times, and it really should have been predictable that most people would play the game with the wiki open rather than indulge in this unfulfilled promise of mystery. In fairness to Macmillan, he does seem to recognize at least some parts of this problem.
The first one to come out that people were really into is the item description mod, which actually, when you walk into a room with an item, text pops up and says, this is what the item does.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And that in itself was such a weird thing for me, because initially when the game had 100 items, I thought I can just make them all mysterious and people will figure them out.
Right.
But now there's 500 and something items, like 510 items, and like it's not fair.
Still, it's impossible to then justify adding mechanics with very high information content like the spin down dice, which is just a cordial invitation to look up a guide online. Likewise, I'm glad they updated Tainted Cain's bag of crafting, but the problem should have been spotted from miles away.
And I thought that was the coolest ever. And then we talked about it being extra cool. Like, it'll be really cool when people finally make like a Wikipedia and that has all the items and everything else. And then that happened within like days. It happened within days, and then it became this like the most boring shit in the world.
Yeah.
Like every single person would play this 5-hour game of Isaac, which was essentially cheating. Essentially, it was just like the wiki open, all the formulas there, and they're just really slowly cheating. Really, like, why not just open debug? Like, why not debug and give you the item that you want? Why do you have to do it this way? So it became this kind of like this is so not fun and not at all how we envisioned it.
This one's easy. The fault isn't in the players, rather the problem was in how the bag of crafting was envisioned. Either way, this mess with information management is partially a problem in its own right, and partially a byproduct of Accretion. If the game hadn't been needlessly bloated with content, this issue would have been more manageable. And vice versa, if the game gave up on substandard mystery, then the Accretion problem would have been slightly less frustrating. Any game designer putting this much noise and information in systems and content should recognize that there are two options: robust and intuitive UI and onboarding for information management, or players constantly alt-tabbing. Better yet, you shouldn't stuff your game like this at all. I also want to mention that elegance isn't only important due to players having to process uninteresting information. Elegance is by itself one of the major Ludo aesthetics. It is essentially the attribute we mean when we say that a game system is beautiful. This is, however, not a point that will change anyone's mind, so I won't elaborate on this further.
There is one more harmful effect caused by Accretion, and it's a particularly nasty one. If you keep stuffing your game with content, eventually you'll bump up against the limits of your design space and start churning out crap.
If you're unfamiliar with the idea of design space, I'm quite proud of my 5-minute video covering the topic, so you should watch that. But simply put, as the designer adds more to the game, they're not just fighting the limits of their own creativity, they're also running out of things they can design within the base systems. There is only so much that your systems can facilitate before it feels like you're kinda reaching.
This marks the point where we stop considering these a priori effects of Accretion. Let's finally zoom in on the actual content design of Isaac. It's hard to describe just how extremely bloated Rebirth and its DLCs are with mediocre ideas. The bottom of the barrel has been scraped clean off together with a layer of topsoil underneath it.
Elegance issues aside, one other consequence is that this dilutes the content, quieting the best ideas. So, in simplest possible terms, if you have 20 good ideas and 20 bad ideas, then half of what you'll find is interesting. Whereas if you have 20 good ideas and 1,000 bad ideas, you'll only be spending a small fraction of your time engaging with the interesting bits. It should be noted that good doesn't refer to the strength of items. Fan criticism has rather narrowly focused on item bloat, lowering the probability of finding, say, brimstone in devil rooms. The problem actually runs deeper. Isaac's Accretion is by no means exclusive to items, and the problem is not that the item pools get weaker, it's that they become less exciting. While we're here, we do have to talk about the 719 items in the fully jacked up version of Rebirth. This is a jungle I dare not venture into without charting a map, so here let's divide this obscene number in a few general trends. First off, stat increases. These are fine, they're boring but provide a needed baseline and filler for the item pools. Relegating a lot of these to the boss item pool is a very smart decision. You're almost guaranteed to at least slightly improve your stats if your synergies don't pan out, and they frequently won't. I feel like proportionally stat changes were slightly too common, but that's a nitpick. Next up, we have some genuinely creative and recontextualizing items. These are everyone's favorites like Mom's Knife, Tech-X, C-Section and such like. However, good items are not the same thing as well-designed items. Marked also belongs in this category despite being highly situational. We should also include items that grant flight, as well as spectral or homing tiers. No complaints here. Next we have items that only shine in specific conditions. Tiny Planet makes your shots spiral around you rather than flying straight, which is absolutely terrible and makes the game less fun, but it finds its use when combined with, for example, Brimstone. Some of these are neat on their own, like Rubber Cement or Continuum. Others will be worthless or actively harmful unless in specific combinations, like My Reflection. Generally, these items are necessary glue to create interesting system behaviors, and we can accept them as long as they create interesting outcomes frequently enough. I appreciate that many of them come with small stat bonuses. So far the categories have been fine, but now we're heading into increasingly problematic areas. Many items simply have a low chance to trigger some effect, usually applying a status effect to an enemy. Remember how I criticized Hades for focusing so much on uninspired status effects? Isaac remains unbeaten on this front. There's a whole heap of effects that hardly ever combine into anything interesting and are generally too boring to really contribute to gameplay. The weird low probabilities seem to exist to justify the otherwise esoteric luck stat, but this game's awkward relationship with randomness is a topic we'll have to return to. We also have a wide array of items that are just noise. Hemoptysis, Tooth and Nail, Contract from Below, Guppy's Tail, and at least half the active items in the game are ideas that don't justify their existence. I'm well aware that there are specific situations in which these items can be good, but in almost all runs these are filler. It's not a matter of being skilled enough to use them effectively, it's the fact that you know you could be having more fun if you found any other item. I don't believe every item has to be useful, but Isaac has already dug a hole for itself with the atrocious game feel. The problem is, if your build consists of nonsense filler, you'll be stuck with something akin to vanilla Isaac. Halfway through many runs, your character will still behave similar to their basic version, with maybe a few stat upgrades, and we already covered the issues with this basic game feel. Some items like Taurus or GB Bug actively make the gameplay process worse, either ruining the game feel or holding the player's attention on slow, unexciting min-maxing. These filler items simply make the game more dull. The next category, familiars, is an extreme form of this same problem. Good God, why is nobody talking about how terrible the familiars are in this game? There's dozens upon dozens of them, and almost all of them are just the same idea repeated. It's not even that good of an idea. I have no clue why they felt the need to add this many familiars that do the same thing. For example, let's look at Brother Bobby. It's a little familiar that follows you around and shoots at nearby enemies for low damage. The idea itself is not bad, but not particularly exciting either. Most notably, it doesn't actually really affect how you play the game. Compare this to the little Loki item, which does the same but shoots tears in a cross pattern. Now, these two are the same item. They technically have a difference, but from the perspective of player experience, they're the same. They're both essentially just a negligible DPS increase that synergizes with any familiar boosting item. Their specific behavior will never come up during the gameplay. Is it bad to have two items that are functionally the same? Not necessarily. It can actually be useful to get certain item types to take up a certain proportion of the total item pool, like it was for stat increases. What's not great is that Isaac reuses this same idea roughly 35 times. All of these are the same item, except maybe some of them are stronger or in the best case synergize with slightly different items. Their actual impact on gameplay is next to identical. If you open the familiars page on the Isaac wiki, you'll see they come in 10 different categories depending on how they behave, and we've only been talking about shooting familiars. In the largest categories, there are up to maybe 5 interesting variations. Most of this is padding. Whenever you encounter a familiar in any of your runs, almost always you'll feel disappointed that you didn't find anything else. Some of these actually tie back to Isaac's unsatisfactory game feel. Items like Lil Gertie do actually affect your input. They expect you to charge and release your fire button in order to use. Spending even the tiniest bit of mental and physical effort on activating a deeply boring and ineffective item, which isn't even tied to your basic interactions, feels bad on a kinesthetic level and not just in the sense of accretion. There's well over 100 permanent familiar items in the game, and they make up a serious portion of many item pools. At least 3/4 should have been purged in development. Last and least, we have some juvenile lol random items. TM Trainer, D4, D100, and a few others are effectively build ruining items, like Missing No just rerolls all your other items at the start of a new floor. Others randomize smaller mechanics like Fruitcake, Zodiac, $3 bill, or Teleport. Again, we'll return to the topic of randomness at a later point, but these hinder your ability to make cool builds, and even moment-to-moment gameplay decisions are actively impeded. They go counter to the game's best qualities.
Taking all this into account, there is but one solution for an item collection like this. Cut, cut, cut. This is, of course, advice that all creatives will give you. Kill your darlings no matter what creative field you're working in, as obviously you can't produce only good ideas. If, God forbid, I was a producer for these games, my first request would have been to remove exactly 50% of the game's items. Just really make the designers carefully consider which ideas are actually important. It's rare for such editorial cutting to reach numbers this extreme, but Isaac is particularly overstuffed with mediocre ideas. It's so bizarre that a development process of this scope didn't have a serious quality control process involving the scrapping of subpar ideas.
But when it comes to Isaac in general, there's usually not much on the cutting room floor at the end because I tend to just add everything, and if it doesn't work, fix it and retune it in some way.
Isaac's collection of items may be particularly egregious, but these issues are also present in other aspects of the game. I already made fun of the game's 188 trinkets. These are mini items that provide smaller effects and only one can be held at a time. Since they're designed to have a comparatively minor effect on the run, the problems that items have are only compounded here. I think the trinket system could work, but so few of them have an actually interesting impact on the game that in the current state I don't believe the system justifies its existence. When you look around, you notice the same problem everywhere. The 22 major arcana cards are used as power-ups in this game. Some of these have interesting effects, for others it seems the devs didn't really have ideas, but by itself this is fine. Through trial and error you pick up on what they do, and it's actually not too hard to keep this information in your head. Obviously, the devs didn't stop there and kept adding more cards well past the point where they had anything actually interesting to contribute. Thus, Repentance arrived with its addition of 22 reverse major arcana cards. So here again we get the same side effects of Accretion. You need to have the wiki open, and many of these are dull. The same applies to the 50 pill power-ups, but overall they matter even less to the game. There's even 2 pill types that literally do nothing. Not even basic gameplay systems escape from this trap of Accretion. They bloated every single system of the game full of unnecessary filler. Just look at Hearts. It's a very classic health system, and as all other health systems, it gives you a certain failure spectrum that you slowly widen as you increase your max health. Straightforward enough, right? The idea is admirably expanded with the very elegant design of Soul Hearts, essentially an armor on top of your max health, which interacts fascinatingly with systems like Devil and Angel rooms. However, you should already know where this is going. The game has 7-ish different heart types, which, like everything else in the game, start off fine and quickly devolve into inelegance. It's that same problem of adding more and more and more stuff into systems. At one point you run out of ideas that the system facilitates. Remember, we called this design space. Isaac reached this point with Red Hearts, Soul Hearts, and Eternal Hearts. Anything past that point is derivative and unnecessary, as with Black Hearts or Golden Hearts, or contrived and clumsy, as with Bone Hearts or Rotten Hearts. All of this and so much more, the characters, the enemies, the shop machines, the beggars, the room types, the status effects, and more, all of this is inflated past the point of sanity, and this brings upon the game all these Accretion-related issues we've discussed.
And then you go through the different mechanics of like, what haven't we done with a familiar? Like, what existing mechanic exists for a familiar that could be expanded into a usable item or a passive effect? And then what kind of trinkets could be invented that would complement those archetypes? And then you're like, how could you take this game that you've done with 108 items, I think, initially, and whatever else was there, and how could you turn this into this huge thing? I would just say more content, because it is designed in a way that allows for a hugely bloated amount of content.
This is the core of Isaac's content design. The question, what else could we possibly add to the game, rather than the much more appropriate question, what else would make the game better?
This obsession with irrelevant detail doesn't just make the gameplay worse, it doesn't just hurt the game design, it also hints at a bizarre production process. There's a strange amount of effort wasted on superfluities that don't even enrich the game. Delirium can transform into roughly 70 different bosses, and even if this didn't cause a major headache for the programmers, all of these bosses have their sprites redone to fit the Delirium color scheme and vibe. All of that work for what amounts to a neat gimmick, a spectacle that the player won't care about past the first time, and that arguably detracts from the gameplay. It's almost poetic that defeating this boss unlocks a little Delirium familiar, which randomly transforms into one of many different familiars, again with unique sprite work. And yet it plays like any other familiar. Brother Bobby affects my gameplay in the same way. This is content design hell. There's a few more of these, like Seven Seals or Book of Virtues. Macmillan has approached some of this with a certain pride, as if these items having more information attached makes them somehow better in terms of design.
This isn't an isolated incident.
Yeah.
There are a lot of items. How many items is Beth's item, Vin? How many items do you think that is?
We're still working
how
on
many?
that.
Yeah, we're still working on that. But how many extra items do we have?
I'd say it's over 100 items.
Even if you disagree with my criticisms of Isaac, I really hope you at least recognize that the misconception of more content being necessarily better for a game is a frustratingly misinformed approach to the medium. It's akin to believing that more detail is what makes a game's graphics beautiful. It's a childish reduction of game design that unfortunately remains very common.
Now, by itself, Accretion isn't the worst sin a game can commit. Gungeon has a comparatively meager 271 items and 243 guns, which is still a lot and still causes Accretion-related problems, but they feel far less pronounced than in Isaac. This is partially due to Gungeon's better provision of information and the overall better content design, but it also brings us back to the topic of progression.
As we concluded, Isaac's unsatisfying game feel demands solid and reliable in-run progression, and Accretion is one of the main reasons why progression in Isaac's runs feels so unsatisfying a lot of the time. But now we should cover the other reason, which is the awkward philosophy towards randomness in Isaac's progression.
A couple of years ago, I released a video called Randomness in Roguelikes. I'm not exactly proud of it, I don't agree with some of the conclusions anymore, and this was before I had found my style, but I suppose it was a decent starting point for investigating the role of randomness in the genre. I claimed that a certain systemic randomness was at the heart of roguelikes, and by this I didn't mean chutes and ladders or slot machines. Rather, randomness plays a key role in the feedback loop through which the systems alter themselves. No matter what happens in chutes and ladders, you're still doing pretty much the same thing, whereas in Noita, randomness affects how you interact with the game and how it functions.
However, this is merely scraping the surface. Randomness belongs to the realm of mechanics, while we're obviously more interested in what it actually implies for the player's experience.
I believe it's related to that idea of curiosity, of exploring an emergent and modular system, and randomness creates a structure through which the player slowly navigates this system. Each run creates a new prompt, shows new dynamics for the player to mess around with and figure out how to utilize. Progression in roguelikes is a multi-dimensional pachinko machine that can land you in many strange corners of the underlying systems. At least this is the ideal scenario. Not all purposes of randomness are so lofty. It also allows for the dopamine of progression to be repeated without getting boring, and as much as we like to sweep this thought under the rug, roguelikes are built on good old Skinner boxes, something you can easily observe in the Vampire Survivors clone swarm masquerading as a subgenre. Considering the importance of randomness in the genre, it feels a little incomplete when some people criticize Isaac for being too random. And yet we shouldn't ignore that randomness is a design tool that comes with its own difficulties. Notably, satisfying and well-paced progression is something that even professional designers struggle with a lot, and obviously randomness has no idea how to design progression, it just hands you stuff without much regard for your experience. Here I decided to take a break from writing this script and conduct a little experiment. To document an example of a super plain Isaac run, I took arguably the most vanilla character, Maggie, and decided to just see what the game's progression offers. In fairness, Maggie starts out particularly boring and unpleasant to play, though this is to some extent true for most characters. We already discussed game feel. So my goal is to find items that recontextualize her right out of the crappy game feel, or at least increase damage output. My first items are Fate's Reward, which is a familiar, and Mom's Coin Purse, which spawns a bunch of pills that end up increasing my max health but lowering my fire rate, further screwing up the damage output. I then found a D7, a rather boring active item that resets the current room, so I stick with my health providing Yum Heart. I also find Tropicamide, a bonus to tier size and range, and a Black Candle, which doesn't improve my moment-to-moment gameplay but negates curses, which I like a lot considering that curses are a really annoying mechanic. I sputter on and find a Lucky Foot, which gives me some luck-related bonuses, then another annoying familiar, and finally some damage increases from Glass Eye and the Pact. You might think this finally makes the game more fun, but at this point the enemies are also scaling up. Here's a clip of how unexciting the combat is for me. Notice how the problem isn't the game being too difficult, the problem is that it's really slow. I find a car battery for better heals, a booster pack which spawns a bunch of cards, and a piggy bank so I get some money whenever I take damage. At this point I'm bored out of my mind, so I head back to writing this essay. Regardless of how you feel about the game overall, you have to admit that this particular run has terrible progression. I know the game can provide interesting builds, but I have just completed the first 4 stages and it's still sluggish, and this is not an uncommon problem. I've seen outcomes like this blamed on the player's skill. Maybe if I didn't keep zoning out, I could have gotten an earlier devil deal, perhaps even the elusive brimstone. Veteran players know all the ways you can manipulate the game's RNG towards broken builds. It's not a good look when the game's best defense is that if you play for hundreds of hours, you might just learn to make the game slightly less dreary. It's tempting to assume such hiccups are inevitable. Randomness will sometimes screw you over, but this issue isn't nearly as pronounced in many newer roguelikes. Let's try to pinpoint the exact nature of the problem. For describing random processes, game design sometimes borrows the term variance from statistics. It is, roughly speaking, how different the outcomes tend to be due to randomness. So if Chutes and Ladders didn't have the eponymous chutes or ladders, the game would have a rather low variance. It would be a random walk where some people are slightly ahead, some fall behind, but overall everyone is progressing at a similar pace. The Chutes and Ladders increase variance. Suddenly the game is more random, or more precisely, randomness creates more varied game states. Isaac is obviously a game with extremely high variance. In my work, I have found it useful to create a new distinction that I haven't seen elsewhere, but that I think could be a valuable addition to a designer's vocabulary: the distinction between vertical variance and horizontal variance. By vertical variance, I mean quantitative, comparable variance. This is what you see in damage rolls, critical hits, Chutes and Ladders, or any other place where some rolls are better than others. Horizontal variance is qualitative, incomparable variance. In Isaac, if we try to compare finding C-section versus finding Holy Mantle, maybe we'll have a personal preference and maybe we believe that one is a bit better than the other, but mostly this is a matter of horizontal variance. These are qualitatively different random outcomes. So, in other words, vertical variance is variance in scale, whereas horizontal variance is variance in type. A roguelike such as Isaac combines horizontal and vertical variance. Sometimes we get a very strong run, other times we get unlucky. This is a matter of vertical variance. Often, however, randomness provides runs that are similar in overall effectiveness, but distinctly different anyway, which is horizontal variance in action. Now, horizontal variance is great. This is tied directly to that fundamental experience of curiosity. Each run gives us a different path for exploring the game's systems. A roguelike without horizontal variance gets stale. Vertical variance, on the other hand, is tricky. It isn't bad, in fact it is necessary for that power rush, that sense of gratification when you get a powerful run. And yet it can create a reliance on lucky rolls, lowering the importance of skill, which obviously feels cheap.
Let's return to Isaac. Isaac's philosophy towards randomness is somewhat reminiscent of Darkest Dungeon. Quoting Macmillan, the player has to deal with the hand they're dealt.
For what it's worth, I like the goal, but I believe it's only reached when the game actually offers the player agency to work with the random result. Like choosing which devil deals to take is an interesting use of random systems. Most of the game, however, consists of slot machines and excessive output randomness, placing as much burden as possible on an unreliable RNG instead of the player. Beggars with a small chance of a big payout, the unpredictable effects of pills, Curse of the Blind, and other systems serve to lower the player's input in their own fate. My Maggie run versus a run that starts with Tech X is very bare-bones vertical variance. Like, regardless of all the talk about working with your hand, one of these is simply worse than the other. It's the RNG doing most of the work, not me. I spent the run dreaming about how much more fun I could have if the game gave me something exciting. Not necessarily powerful, just exciting. In this regard, Isaac is very simply aged. An excellent trend in newer roguelikes is letting the player choose one of several items. A smidgen of agency might be the key to well-designed vertical variance. Most of Isaac's vertical variance is an uninvolved slot machine. Compare this to Slay the Spire, which offers roughly even card and artifact drops in each run, but it has very high vertical variance as you figure out synergies between the cards you're offered. When you succeed, it's probably because you played well, not because the stars favored you. And mind you, sometimes you still get lucky. A roguelike doesn't need to be entirely skill-based with no luck involved. But crucially, Slay the Spire's randomness doesn't feel like a passive process. It's the difference between I discovered a good build versus a good build happened to me. Macmillan is a smart designer. He recognizes at least some part of this issue, and he surely knows that bare vertical variance can feel really cheap. This is why items were so heavily rebalanced in Repentance and why item weights or damage scaling was added. He very correctly identified that the game was often too easy.
Like, I wanted the fights to last longer because I hated people getting super busted and then walking into a final boss room and then the boss just instantly dying.
I think he would even appreciate how some newer roguelikes rein in unnecessary vertical variance. Enter the Gungeon not only increases the chance of finding better chests later in a run, but also has a really clever negative feedback loop where your probability of finding high quality items is lowered if you're already overpowered. Isaac used to have a somewhat similar approach, but the implementation was flimsy and it was thankfully discontinued. Overall, Macmillan seems to have mainly targeted overpowered builds rather than recognizing the more fundamental problems. He really insists that systems like curses or pills, largely just random dice rolls with very little player agency, are a necessary part of the experience.
I love Curse of the Blind.
That's a good curse. That's legit. Take your fucking pills. Use those pills. Take those pills.
This is just randomness for the sake of randomness. What exactly are these adding to the game? Systems like shops, devil deals, or even smaller additions like the D6 show that the game can offer exciting randomness with player choice. Many other popular modern roguelikes also show how agency is compatible with exciting unpredictability. Slay the Spire has working with the hand that you're dealt. Isaac's pills, meanwhile, are largely just fuck yous to the player. Tears Down, isn't that cool? Don't you feel like you're working with the hand you're dealt? Any of these systems that affect progression through randomness without offering any player input reduce the progression to a mindless slot machine. They don't achieve that entirely valid goal of players making good use of strange situations. And choosing whether to take an unknown pill isn't the deep strategic dilemma some paint it as. Player agency requires more than making choices, it's about making informed choices. Curse of the Blind is a particularly bad offender. It's poetic, really. There's a random chance that the game will take away even the minimal agency to figure out if an item is worth taking. There's even a low but very real chance that picking up one of these unknown items might completely trash your entire run. You're not even permitted the little smidgen of strategy that treasure rooms usually offer. I say this with a lot of confidence. Isaac would be a better game if it gave the player multiple options in each treasure room, angel room, and boss room, balancing not accounted for. Mechanics like pills, curses, low random items, slot machines, and variations thereof only serve to make the game worse. Regardless of whether you feel like the game actually gets really skill-based 500 hours in, you have to admit that these systems design decisions lower the importance of the player's input. I'm not saying that more agency is always better, and it's only necessary that randomness restricts the possible outcomes to some degree. But Isaac's progression is so restrictive that you sometimes feel like a passive observer. There is a promise of strategy in the format that remains unexplored in Isaac. I like to wonder, but I simply can't know Macmillan's feelings with regards to player agency.
And there's a growing trend with some roguelites today that are allowing you to go in as the player and either turn off certain items that you don't want to see in the game.
Quite a few people end up playing this game by just resetting again and again until after 10 minutes they stumble into Mom's Knife or another very powerful starting item. This behavior, called RNG abuse, is obviously a serious game design flaw. It's simply uninteresting to hold the reset button for several minutes non-stop. Even for people who willingly do it, it's a miserable time.
It just pains me to, I'll look at a stream and I'll see somebody just holding R and then until they fucking get a good item and it's just like, all right.
There are, of course, people who just like to restart the game if they don't like what the hand that they're dealt, but I'm the kind of person that revels in that. I think experiencing each run with the hand that you're dealt, regardless of if it's good or bad, or the synergies are good or bad. There's still a lot of reward in that, and in a lot of ways, it shows you that when you're dealt a hand and you succeed, you feel much better about what's going on, and I think there's something to that as well.
Yet RNG abuse makes sense almost from a game theory standpoint. Why would you ever go through this slog if you can, with some mild delayed gratification, feel powerful instead? The alternative is gritting your teeth and accepting a deeply boring gameplay experience. Macmillan treats it as an oddity in player behavior, when really it's a natural consequence of this design and it isn't shared by other popular modern roguelikes, at least not nearly to this extent.
In fairness, we should conclude the topic by pointing out that Isaac's design must be evaluated in two ways simultaneously. First, as we have been doing thus far, we should criticize it regardless of external circumstance, while at the same time we have to recognize that the games we compare weren't all made in the same market. Isaac is the pioneer that younger roguelikes could learn from when they expanded the basic structure in new directions. It has become well recognized that imbuing roguelike progression with basic agency works better, but Isaac was made before this revelation. And yet it is important to explore the specific ways in which Isaac's relationship with randomness is worse than the more modern approach. We need to understand why unfettered randomness goes counter to the roguelike promise, otherwise we fail to recognize the genre's evolution since then and the value of those new changes. I should again bring up the video's goal, not to criticize the game for its own sake, but to learn from its game design flaws. And design of randomness is one of those areas where it's only healthy that Isaac is no longer the genre's blueprint.
Concluding this critique, let's circle back to the topic of system modularity. Modularity gives us the most optimistic reasoning behind roguelike appeal. It plants the seeds for the player's curiosity, and progression provides the fertilizer. To me, discovering and understanding the unexpected system behaviors represents not just the best parts of Isaac, but of the genre as a whole. However, if we look at roguelikes more cynically, we're just monkeys that love dopamine. Game design knows two very easy and cheap ways of generating dopamine, and those are extrinsic rewards, of which progression is the most effective, and Skinner boxes. Roguelikes are, again very cynically and reductively speaking, progression tied to a Skinner box. My favorite roguelikes try to steer as close to this lofty vision of curiosity as possible. Noita and Slay the Spire are the most fascinating examples I can think of. I have much less respect for roguelikes that feel like power fantasy slot machines.
Isaac is in an awkward position where it had incredible potential for both this intrinsic curiosity and extrinsic gratification, but on account of the flaws we covered, it didn't fulfill its potential on the intrinsic front. The three problems we discussed work in a perfect negative synergy. Because the basic moveset is so unpleasant to interact with, the game has to rely on its progression. And yet progression is where we find the issues of accretion and unfettered randomness. It's the unholy trinity cursing the game's design. Still, it remains a growing trend that people are increasingly drawn to extrinsic rewards. Even with all the problems, Isaac's popularity is only to be expected. If you are looking for simple dopamine, Isaac offers one of the best slot machines in the market.
I've kept playing Isaac for hundreds of hours, and I'm not ashamed to admit it's the extrinsic I feel drawn to. I'm playing for the Skinner box that promises the payout of TechX with homing tiers, and it justifies itself with the completionist trap of slowly filling that collection of completion marks for all characters. It works well as a dopamine generator, and if that's all you need, then please enjoy yourself. If it's something more you're after, well, the game falls a bit short. And yet, reiterating again, if we actually talk about the value of the game, these criticisms are swept away by the wonderful novelty of the franchise. The point isn't that these games are bad or disappointing, the point is that they have problems we can learn from, and which the genre is actively learning from as long as they are recognized as problems.
In a sense, I suppose I'm still waiting for an action roguelike that nails this format. The modularity of Isaac and some of its pacing, but with the modern sense of agency and without Isaac's other major issues. If that game already exists and I just haven't played it, you have to tell me. Who knows, perhaps we'll see this ideal roguelike format when Macmillan gives us the sequel that he's been teasing but not actively working on at the time of this video's release. When this sequel comes, I sincerely hope it makes serious changes to the mechanics and learns from the genre's later refinements. By the time it releases, these systems will no longer be novel, and even if we can love the Binding of Isaac with all its problems, they would, in this hypothetical future, weigh heavier.